Do not wait for the perfect moment, because the perfect moment almost never comes. Many people say, I will start when I have more time, more money, more confidence. But days pass, weeks pass, even years pass, and they are still waiting. The truth is this: the best moment to begin is now. Start where you are. Start with the little that you have. Start with the little time you can give. Progress does not come from waiting, it comes from moving. Even one small step creates momentum. Even one small word you read today, or one small sentence you listen to today, can open the door to growth. Reading and listening practice does not need to be perfect. It does not need to be long. It needs to be daily. It needs to be consistent. This is why you are here now. To listen, to read, to practice, to grow. Your mistakes are not signs of failure. They are signs that you are learning. Every mistake means you are trying, and every time you try, you improve. The voice in your head may whisper doubt, but belief is stronger. If you choose belief, you choose action. If you choose action, you choose growth. And if you choose growth, your dream becomes real. So let us begin together. Not tomorrow, not later, but here now, with this practice, with this story, with this moment. Start where you are, and you will go further than you ever imagined. So many people wait and wait, always looking for the perfect moment to begin. They say to themselves, I will start tomorrow when I have more time. I will begin next week when I feel ready. I will begin when I have the right teacher, the right book, the right place. But the truth is that tomorrow often never arrives. The truth is that readiness is not something you wait for. Readiness is something you build by taking action. And the longer you wait, the heavier the waiting feels. The more fear grows, the more doubt grows. And the more distant your dream becomes. So if you want to learn, if you want to grow, if you want to change your life, you must learn to start exactly where you are. Even if you feel unprepared, even if you feel unsure, because one small beginning is more powerful than 1,000 perfect plans that never leave your mind. Think about it this way. A person who reads 1 page a day will finish books in a year, but a person who waits for the perfect day may finish nothing at all. A person who listens for 10 minutes each morning will hear hundreds of new words in a year, but a person who waits for a perfect teacher may still be waiting 12 months later. So starting small is not weakness. Starting small is strength. Because every big change, every big dream, every big success begins with one small step. When you read 1 line aloud, when you listen to 1 short audio, when you write down 1 simple word, you are proving to yourself that you can move, you can grow, you can do it. And that first step is never wasted. It is the seed of transformation. It is the proof that you are willing to walk forward. And once you take that first step, the second becomes easier. And the third becomes easier still. Soon you build a chain, a rhythm, a habit, and this habit becomes the engine that drives you forward. And you discover that progress does not come from rare, perfect moments. It comes from steady, daily effort, even if it is just a few minutes, even if it feels small, because practice is like water dripping on stone, slow, quiet, patient, yet strong enough to shape even the hardest rock. And this is why you must not wait. This is why you must begin with what you have now, because you already have enough. You have your mind, you have your voice, you have your courage, you have access to books, to stories, to sounds, to videos, to people around you, and every one of these is a resource. Every one of these is a chance to practice. You do not need perfect conditions. You do not need expensive tools. You need the decision to act. And that decision can be made today, right now, this very moment. And once you make it, once you say to yourself, I will no longer wait, I will start here, I will start now, you begin to feel a new energy inside. You begin to feel momentum. You begin to believe that progress is possible. And that belief is what carries you through the hard days, through the days when you feel tired, through the days when you feel discouraged, and yet you keep moving. Because you know that even on a slow day, even on a difficult day, one small act of practice is still a victory. One small line read aloud, one small paragraph listened to, one small page studied. All of these keep you moving forward, and this forward movement builds strength. It builds discipline. It builds confidence. Until one day you look back and realize how far you have come. You realize that the choice to begin, the choice to start with what you had, was the most important choice of all. And you smile because you understand now that the perfect moment is not something you wait for. The perfect moment is something you create by beginning. And by beginning again, and by beginning again tomorrow. So start where you are. Do not wait, because the life you want is waiting for you to take that first brave step today. Every great journey in history, every skill ever mastered, every dream ever achieved began with a single first step. And yet that first step is often the hardest to take, because the mind fills with questions. The heart fills with fear, and doubt whispers, "What if I fail? What if I make a mistake? What if others laugh at me? What if I am not ready?" But here is the truth. Mistakes are not the end. Mistakes are the beginning because they are proof that you are moving, proof that you are alive in the process, proof that you are learning. So instead of fearing mistakes, you must welcome them, because every mistake you make today becomes the lesson that makes you stronger tomorrow. And when you take that very first step, even if it feels small, even if it feels clumsy, even if it feels imperfect, you are sending a powerful message to yourself that says, "I believe in me, I believe in my growth, I believe in my journey." And this belief begins to silence doubt. It does not remove doubt completely, because doubt is part of being human, but belief becomes stronger than doubt. Belief becomes the voice that says, "Yes, I can try, yes, I can learn, yes, I can continue." And with each small step forward, belief grows louder, courage grows stronger, and progress becomes visible. Think about a person standing in front of a mountain. If they wait until they feel no fear, they will stand forever at the bottom. But if they take one step upward, even with shaking legs, they begin to climb. And that single step proves that the mountain can be moved. Not in one leap, but in many small steps repeated again and again. And so it is with language learning. So it is with reading. So it is with listening. So it is with speaking. You do not need to finish the journey in one day. You only need to begin, and once you begin, you have already defeated the hardest enemy, which is hesitation. Hesitation is heavy. Hesitation is silent. Hesitation holds you in place while your dream moves further away. But action, even the smallest action, breaks hesitation. It breaks the chains of fear. It creates energy. It creates momentum. And momentum is what carries you further than you thought possible. So do not underestimate the first step, because the first step is the seed, the spark, the beginning of transformation. And when doubt tries to stop you, when it says you are not good enough, you must answer with belief. Belief does not mean you are perfect. Belief does not mean you never fall. Belief means you choose to act despite fear. Belief means you choose to try even when the outcome is uncertain. Belief means you trust that the act of beginning will make you stronger. And this is why the first step matters so much. Because the first step is not just about progress. It is about identity. It changes the way you see yourself. From someone who is waiting to someone who is doing. From someone who is doubting to someone who is believing. From someone who is dreaming to someone who is acting. And once you see yourself this way, once you call yourself a learner, a doer, a starter, you can never return to the place of hesitation again. You have crossed the line and you are on the journey. And that journey may be long and it may be difficult, but it is yours. And every single step you take adds to your story, your growth, your success. So never let doubt be the final voice. Let belief be louder. Let action speak for you. Let courage walk with you. And remember that the first step is not the end of fear. The first step is proof that fear does not control you. And from there, every new step becomes easier. Every new action becomes stronger. Every new moment becomes a victory. Until one day you look back and say, "I was afraid, I was uncertain, but I began. And because I began, I grew. And because I grew, I became the person I always wanted to be." Success in learning does not come from big, dramatic moments that happen once in a while. Success comes from the quiet rhythm of small, steady practice repeated every day because the mind learns through repetition, and confidence grows through consistency. Imagine a person who studies for 5 hours one day and then does nothing for the next 2 weeks. They will quickly forget, they will feel frustrated, they will believe they are not making progress. But imagine another person who studies for 10 minutes every day. 10 minutes of reading, 10 minutes of listening, 10 minutes of practice day after day, week after week. This person will remember more. This person will feel steady growth. This person will find themselves surprised at how much progress has built up over time. Because consistency is more powerful than intensity, small daily practice creates deep roots. Small daily practice keeps the knowledge alive. And small daily practice builds habits that carry you forward automatically, like brushing your teeth or drinking water, and once practice becomes a habit, it no longer feels heavy, it feels natural. It feels part of your life. And this is the secret of learners who succeed. They do not rely on bursts of energy. They rely on steady effort. They do not wait for motivation. They rely on discipline. They do not depend on perfect conditions. They use whatever resources they already have. Because waiting for expensive courses, waiting for new books, waiting for perfect teachers is another form of delay, and delay is the enemy of growth. But creativity and resourcefulness turn every environment into a classroom. When you do not have a teacher, you can teach yourself with free videos. When you do not have a textbook, you can write words in a simple notebook. When you do not have a language partner, you can read aloud to yourself or record your voice. When you do not have time for long lessons, you can practice short sentences on your phone while waiting for the bus. When you do not have confidence to speak in public, you can practice quietly at home, whispering the words until your tongue becomes comfortable. Because the truth is, you already have more than enough to begin. You already have words around you, signs on the street, subtitles on videos, conversations in shops, songs on the radio. You already have the power to turn every moment into practice. You only need to open your eyes, open your ears, and use what is available. And when you practice with consistency, when you turn practice into habit, when you use the resources in your hands, your progress multiplies, your confidence rises, and your dream moves closer. Because learning is not about waiting for the perfect tool. Learning is about using the tools you have today, and using them again tomorrow, and again the next day, until they shape you into the person you want to become. So do not think that you are too poor, too busy, too unprepared. You are already rich in resources. Rich in time if you use it wisely. Rich in opportunities if you open your eyes. Because every book you touch, every audio you hear, every sentence you repeat is an investment in your growth. And over time, these investments create a future that looks completely different from your past. A future where you are confident, capable, and free, all because you built the habit of practice, all because you used what you had. All because you stopped waiting and started moving with consistency and creativity. Learning is not a race. It is not a straight line. It is not something you finish in one day or even 1 year. Learning is a process that takes time, and time can often feel slow. And when progress feels slow, many learners become frustrated. They say, I am studying every day, but I do not see results. I am practicing, but I still make mistakes. I am trying, but I do not feel fluent. And in these moments, patience becomes the most important skill. Because patience is not just waiting. Patience is trusting the process. Patience is choosing to continue even when the results are not visible yet. Patience is like planting seeds in the ground. You water them every day, you look at the soil, and for weeks you may see nothing. You may feel that nothing is happening, but deep inside the soil, the seed is breaking open. The roots are spreading. Life is preparing to rise. And one day the green shoot breaks the surface, and you see the reward of your patience. Learning is the same. You read and listen and repeat, and sometimes it feels invisible. But inside your brain, new connections are growing. Inside your memory, new patterns are forming. Inside your heart, new courage is building. And suddenly one day you understand a sentence without translation. Suddenly you read a page smoothly. Suddenly you speak and surprise yourself. and you realize that patience has carried you to this moment. But patience alone is not enough. You also need to remember your why, the deep reason inside you that makes the effort worth it. Maybe your why is your family. Maybe your why is your career. Maybe your why is travel. Maybe your why is freedom. Whatever it is the fire that keeps you moving. Because there will be days when you feel tired. There will be days when you feel hopeless. There will be days when progress feels impossible. And on those days, remembering your why gives you strength. Remembering your why gives you discipline. Remembering your why gives you joy. So connect every small act of practice to your bigger purpose. Connect every page you read to your dream. Connect every word you repeat to your family's future. Connect every sentence you listen to with the life you want to live. Because when you see practice not as a chore but as a bridge to your dream, patience becomes easier, persistence becomes natural, and joy becomes part of the journey. And this is how learners who succeed keep moving forward. They do not look only at the slow progress of today. They look at the vision of tomorrow. They remember their why. They water their seeds with patience. And they trust that growth is happening even when it is invisible. So you must do the same. You must breathe, you must trust, you must continue. And you must remember why you began in the first place. Because your why is your compass. Your why is your anchor. Your why is your motivation when nothing else feels strong. And with patience and purpose together, you will not only continue the journey, you will also enjoy it. You will feel peace knowing that every step matters, every effort counts, and every day brings you closer to the dream that inspired you to begin. Fear is a natural part of learning. Fear of making mistakes, fear of being embarrassed, fear of not being good enough. And this fear can feel heavy. It can hold you back. It can whisper in your ear. Do not speak, you will sound silly. Do not try, you will fail, do not continue. It is too hard, and if you listen to fear too often, you will stop yourself before you even begin. But courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is the decision to act even while fear is still present. Courage is when you say, yes, I am afraid, but I will try anyway. Yes, I might fail, but I will learn anyway. Yes, I might be embarrassed, but I will grow anyway. And every time you act with courage, every time you speak even when your voice shakes, every time you try even when you are not ready, your fear becomes smaller, your courage becomes stronger, and soon the things that once scared you become normal. What once felt impossible becomes natural. And this is how courage transforms you. Not by removing fear completely, but by teaching you that fear is not the master, you are the master. And with courage, you begin to build persistence. Because courage helps you face the first moment of fear, but persistence helps you face the many struggles that come after. And struggles will come. Mistakes will come. Rejection will come. Slow days will come. But persistence is the ability to continue anyway. Persistence is the choice to rise again after you fall. Persistence is the power to see challenges not as walls that stop you, but as steps that lift you higher. Imagine a river hitting a rock. The river does not quit. The river does not turn back. The river flows around. The river flows over. The river continues until the rock is shaped. Persistence is like this river. Steady, unstoppable, always moving forward. And when you combine courage with persistence, you become unstoppable too. Because courage pushes you to take action despite fear, and persistence pushes you to keep going despite struggle. Together, they form the foundation of every success story, every language learned, every dream achieved. So do not run from fear, face it. Do not quit when struggles come. Continue, because each time you face fear, you grow braver. Each time you persist, you grow stronger. And one day you will realize that fear has turned into confidence, struggle has turned into skill, and your persistence has carried you to a place that once felt impossible. So remember, fear will always knock on your door, but you do not have to invite it in. Courage will always be available to you if you choose it. Persistence will always be your companion if you walk with it, and if you do, there is no obstacle strong enough to stop you. No mistake big enough to break you. No failure final enough to end you. Because courage and persistence together create resilience. And resilience is the mark of a true learner, a true dreamer, a true achiever. Learning can sometimes feel lonely, especially when you practice by yourself. When you sit at a desk with only your notebook. When you read aloud in a quiet room where no one else can hear you. When you listen to recordings with your headphones and wonder if anyone else in the world is on the same journey. And in those moments, loneliness can feel heavy, like a shadow pressing on your shoulders. And it is easy to think, maybe this path is not for me. Maybe I cannot continue alone. Maybe my dream is too far away. But there is a secret that many successful learners have discovered. A secret that changes everything, and that secret is community. Because learning was never meant to be a silent, isolated road. Learning was always meant to be shared. Spoken, practiced, exchanged, and when you walk with others, the road feels lighter. When you learn with others, the silence is broken. When you practice with others, the fear grows smaller and the joy grows stronger. Think about how much easier it feels to take a long walk when a friend walks beside you. The distance feels shorter. The air feels fresher. The journey feels easier. Or think about how much more exciting it feels to sing when others sing with you. Your voice feels braver. The mistakes feel less important. The music feels fuller. This is what community gives you. It gives you courage that you cannot always find alone. It gives you energy that you cannot always create by yourself. It gives you accountability that reminds you to continue when you feel lazy or tired. And suddenly you are no longer learning only for yourself. You are learning for the group. You are learning to share. You are learning to connect, and this connection becomes powerful fuel, because human beings are wired to grow together, not in isolation, but in connection. And when you surround yourself with people who share your dream, who share your struggles, who share your victories, you realize that you are not alone. You realize that your story is part of a larger story. You realize that your journey is part of a greater movement, and this realization gives you hope. It gives you strength, it gives you resilience. And this is why learners who find community often progress faster. Because they do not carry their fear alone. They do not carry their doubts alone. They do not carry their failures alone. They share them, they speak them, they laugh about them, they encourage each other through them. And they discover that the very things that once felt heavy now feel light because they are carried together. And when you combine this support with your own daily practice, your own persistence, your own courage, something extraordinary happens. You begin to transform, not only in skill, but in identity, not only in ability, but in confidence. Transformation is not sudden. It is not magic. It is the slow and steady result of everything you have been doing, every word you have read, every sentence you have listened to, every conversation you have attempted, every mistake you have corrected, every time you chose courage over fear, and every time you showed up for your community and allowed your community to show up for you. And at first, transformation is quiet, almost invisible. Like the way children grow taller little by little until one day you notice how much they have changed. Like the way seasons change leaf by leaf until suddenly the whole forest looks new. Your growth is the same. You may not see it every day, but it is happening, it is unfolding. And then one day you surprise yourself. You understand a book you could not read before. You follow a conversation you once thought was too fast. You express your thoughts clearly where once you struggled. And in that moment you realize you are no longer the same person who began the journey. You have transformed, and your transformation does not stop with you. Because when you grow, you inspire others. When you succeed, you give hope to others. When you share your story, you light the way for others. And this is the power of growth in community. It multiplies, it spreads, it lifts not just one person, but many. Like a candle lighting other candles without losing its own flame. Like a river flowing into many branches without losing its strength. Your growth becomes part of a cycle where you receive encouragement, and later you give encouragement. Where you receive help and later you give help. Where you once followed and now you lead. And this cycle of giving and receiving, of supporting and being supported, is what makes the learning journey sustainable, joyful, and deeply human. So never believe the lie that you must walk alone. Never believe the voice that says community is not important. Never believe the fear that says you are weak for needing others, because needing others is not weakness. It is wisdom, and supporting others is not a burden. It is a blessing, and together these truths lead to transformation. Transformation not only of skill, but also of character. Transformation not only of ability, but also of confidence. Transformation not only of the learner, but also of the community. And in time, transformation of the world itself, because education is a ripple. When you learn, you change yourself. When you change yourself, you change the people close to you. When the people close to you change, they influence others. And soon one simple choice to read a page, to listen to a sentence, to practice with courage, to join a community becomes the starting point of transformation far greater than you imagined. So open your heart to community. Open your hands to support. Open your life to growth. And know that you are not only building your own future, you are helping to build the future of everyone who learns beside you. And together, your shared transformation will prove to the world that change is possible. Growth is real, and courage always wins. In the end, everything comes down to this simple truth. Waiting will never bring you closer to your dream. Only action will, and action does not need to be perfect. It does not need to be grand. It only needs to be taken, one small step at a time. Because when you look back at every lesson you have heard in this journey, you see the same message repeated again and again in different forms. Start where you are, take the first step, believe instead of doubt, practice consistently. Use what you have, be patient, remember your why, face your fear, persist through struggles, walk with community, and trust in transformation. These are not just ideas. They are the blueprint for real change, the foundation for lasting growth, the path for anyone who truly wants to become more than they are today. And maybe you feel tired now. Maybe you feel overwhelmed. Maybe you wonder if all of this is really possible for you, but listen carefully. Every person who has ever achieved anything great has felt the same doubts. Every learner who has ever spoken fluently once stumbled on their first words. Every confident person you admire once began as a nervous beginner. The difference is not that they were braver than you, or smarter than you, or richer than you. The difference is that they began, and they continued. They allowed themselves to grow. They trusted the process, and over time they transformed, and you can too. Because you are no different, you have the same ability, the same mind, the same heart, the same power to choose action over waiting, belief over doubt, persistence over quitting, courage over fear. And if you do this day after day, if you show up for yourself with patience, if you honor your why, if you lean on your community, you will look back one day and not recognize the person you once were. Because you will be stronger, you will be wiser, you will be freer. And your journey will not only have changed you, but will have touched the lives of others. And this is the final truth you must carry with you, that your growth is not just for you. It is for everyone you meet, everyone you inspire, everyone you help, everyone who sees your courage and believes they can find courage too. So now the choice is in your hands. You can close this story and go back to waiting, or you can take this moment, this very moment, and decide that you will begin. You will practice, you will believe, you will persist, you will grow, because the future is not given, the future is created, and your future begins the moment you say yes to yourself, yes to your dream, yes to your growth, yes to your transformation. So take a deep breath, stand tall, and step forward because your journey has already begun, and the best of you is still to come.